Colman by Monica Furlong. Chapter 1. 4 of us escaped on Finbar's ship after Juniper's trial as a witch. Juniper, Wise Child, Cormac, and me. There had been so much fear for all of us except Finbar. A terrible walk across the island for Juniper and Wise Child. And then suddenly we were all sailing across a peaceful sea, safe at last. It was only a few weeks since Juniper had lived at the White House and had taken care of my cousin, Wise Child, and had helped the people of the village with remedies for their sicknesses and accidents. Then came the accusation of black magic, with the sequel of torture and possible death, and Juniper, who had been arrested and imprisoned, had only just escaped in time. And now the 5 of us were on that ship, along with Finbar's men. It was a beautiful evening. Juniper and Wise Child sat in the stern of the boat, watching the sunset and recovering from their ordeal. Wise Child small and dark, Juniper with her arm around her. Juniper's long black hair blew wildly about until she put her shawl over it to tame it. Cormac stood staring over the stern, with his scarred, damaged face, seeing the island grow smaller and smaller. I guess he had few regrets for the place where he had known great unhappiness. Me, although I felt bad about leaving Mam and my brothers and sisters without saying goodbye, I was very glad to get away from Dad and his belt, and to have started an adventure with the people I loved best, not counting my family. It was terribly exciting to be on a ship like Finbar's. It had sails, something I had never seen before. The island boats were small and light and made out of wicker and hide, whereas Finbar's boat, like the Berlins on which I had occasionally traveled to the mainland with my father, was made out of wood. And now, with the wind behind us, we had begun to move rapidly and would sail for distances I had barely dreamed of. Already we had passed islands of which I did not even know the names. I followed Finbar about, listening to him giving orders and imagining myself as captain of a ship. Soon Finbar suggested chores I could do like a proper sailor. One of the men showed me how to coil a rope, and Cully, the ship's cook, got me peeling vegetables in the galley. That first night was a joyful one. Finbar broached some wine, and even Wise Child and I were given a generous amount with a splash of water. It was too soon to start asking any of the difficult questions about where we would go and what we would do. We were all just glad to be together and to be safe. I did notice that Wise Child seemed a little shy of Finbar. Although he was her dad, he had been at sea for several years, and she had looked forward to his return for so long. I think she was surprised to find that he seemed like a stranger to her. Perhaps his sheer size was intimidating. Finbar was a very tall man with a beard and strong, handsome features. He had black hair and brilliant blue eyes, just like her own, along with wonderful pale skin. We enjoyed our feast. We were all really hungry. And then Finbar found beds for all of us. He turned out of his bunk and put Juniper in it. Wise Child he put in a little made-up bed on the floor. He slung hammocks for himself and for Cormac, and me on the deck. I did not go to sleep for hours. It seemed a pity to waste my excitement in sleep. I loved watching the movement of the stars overhead and feeling the gentle movement of the ship. I fell asleep at last and slept well, but was awakened in the early morning by shouting. A strong wind was blowing, and the sea had become much rougher. The sailors were clambering up the mast and along the yard arm, pulling in sails and tying them into place. I hastily did up my trousers and folded my hammock, wanting to be part of it all. We were passing through a channel with land on both sides. "That's Ireland," one of the sailors shouted to me, pointing to starboard. "They call this the North Channel." Before I could offer my services as a sailor, Finbar ordered me down to the galley. Cully was already at work gutting some fish, and I helped him clean up afterward. "Fancy a bit of bacon, boy?" he asked when we had finished. I nodded. "The sea hasn't put you off your breakfast, then?" I thought about it. No, my stomach felt fine. "I'd like your help. There's a lot to do on a ship on a morning like this, and it's important not to get in the men's way." It occurred to me later that Finbar had asked him to tell me this in a way that did not hurt my feelings. "Have you washed?" he then surprised me by asking. I shook my head. "Must keep clean on a ship, especially when you're a cook." He nodded to a flagon of water in the corner with a cloth beside it, and under his eye I washed my face and hands. I had not realized sailors were so fussy. Then I started chopping onions until the tears ran down my face. I had just started on a mound of cabbage when a sailor appeared at the door. "Captain sends his compliments and would like to talk to you, sir," he said to me. "He's at the wheel." I was so overcome at being called sir that I just mumbled, "All right," but Cully prompted me quietly, "Aye, aye." I duly echoed him, then followed the sailor above deck. Finbar made a fine figure at the wheel, and for a few moments did not speak to me. Finbar, I learned, was a man of long silences. "We are having a council of war tonight, Colman," he said at last. "All of us to decide where to go, what to do. But I wanted to talk to you first. It seems bad luck that you have got caught up in all this and dragged away from your family. I dare not let you go back, however. They would certainly suspect you were involved in the escape because of your friendship with Wisechild." I nodded. If I went back, there would be endless questions, and my dad would do his best to beat the truth out of me. I was much more frightened of him than I was of Cormac's brother, Furlong, the priest, who, during the time of famine and the smallpox epidemic, had roused the people against Juniper. There was little hardship for me in going on a voyage with my favorite people. The effort of explaining all this felt too great. I grinned instead and said, "I don't mind." Finbar looked at me in a searching way with eyes that were so much like Wisechild's. Then he shook his head slightly and laughed. "So be it." It was not till I saw Wisechild and Juniper in Finbar's cabin that evening that I realized that though they had escaped, the ordeal was not over for them. The previous night they had seemed calm, serene. Tonight, however, Juniper looked pale and drawn, entirely unlike her usual rosy self. There were shadows under her eyes, and she kept propping up her head with her hand, as if she was too exhausted to hold it upright. Wisechild had been seasick in the course of the day. Now she lay on Finbar's bunk, white and indifferent, with closed eyes. I don't think at that moment she cared very much what became of her. "I know this is not a good time for you, but we need to make some plans," Finbar began. "Obviously, it may be months or even years before you can return to the White House." "If ever," put in Juniper quietly. "So that we need to think what to do next," Finbar continued. "Cormac has an idea that he has put to me." Finbar nodded at our friend, and we all leaned in close to listen. Until Juniper had healed him, Cormac had been afflicted by leprosy. Though his sores had closed, his face, with its mutilated nose and twisted mouth, would be forever scarred. Cormac's speech was never easy to understand, but that night his meaning came across quite clearly. "We are near Ireland now, and will be for some hours," he said. "Just before the southeastern tip there is a big harbor, an estuary, into which the river Slaney opens. If you follow the Slaney for an hour or so, you come to a small harbor for the village of Ennis. It is there that my aunt and uncle lived, and where I grew up after my mother died. My aunt and uncle have a large farm. I am sure we could use one of the barns for a few weeks while we make our future plans. Juniper and Wise Child need a place where they can rest and be looked after for a bit, and my aunt would understand that." Cormac looked tenderly at Juniper as he said this, and his badly scarred face looked more like that of the man he must have once been. "I like the idea," said Finbar. "We could be there tomorrow." He looked questioningly at Juniper, and suddenly I realized all that Juniper had lost and perhaps would never see again. Her beautiful white house on the mountain, her land, her herbs, and her animals. "What do you think?" Finbar said to Juniper. "I like Cormac's idea," she said, "as long as our stay is a brief one. It may be foolish of me, but I cannot quite give up the idea that when Fillon cannot find me and Wise Child on the island, and realizes that Cormac has disappeared too, it might just occur to him that somehow we have got across the sea to Ennis. Probably that is entirely fanciful, but that is my fear." "It is not entirely a fancy," Finbar put in. "The Holy Trinity apart, you might have hired a boat from someone, and they may think of that." "I think it will take him a while to get round to that possibility, even if he cares enough to pursue me," said Juniper. "In the long term, however, I can see only one solution, which is that we go to Cornwall. My father is Regulus there, as you know, and will give us a piece of land if I ask him, perhaps build us a house." We always tended to forget it, but Juniper was, of course, a princess, the daughter of King Mark, the Regulus of Cornwall. "I thought you might say that, and I think that should be our goal," said Finbar. "For the time being, however, I favor Cormac's idea." He looked kindly at Juniper. I knew from my mother's gossip that he and Juniper had been sweethearts many years earlier, before Wise Child's mother had lured him away. "Might it not be awkward for you, Cormac?" Juniper asked. "Presumably your aunt would also regard Fillon as kin." "Fillon left home as a lad of 12 to pursue his studies with the monks," said Cormac, "and has never been back. They never liked him much, nor he them. He's almost forgotten there. I don't think that will be a problem." He paused. "However, some said that Aunt Bridget loved me more than her own son. That was one of the reasons I left. Colman became jealous, and I did not want to cause trouble. If there are any objections, they will come from him." "I think we should try it," said Finbar. "I do not think Wise Child and Juniper should have to spend much longer at sea. Are we agreed?" There was a murmur of assent. "Wise Child, is there anything you want to say?" Finbar asked. My cousin groaned. "I just want to get off the boat," she said. "I sympathize," said Finbar briskly, not as if he sympathized much at all. I guess he had seen a good deal of seasickness in his years at sea. "Colman?" Somehow I could not do anything except smile. I would go anywhere with these people. Earlier that day, the wind had dropped a bit, and Finbar had let me take the wheel for a spell. "He's as good as a cabin boy," one of the sailors had said, and although I knew he was trying to be nice, I was pleased. I was loving the voyage. The next day, as the light was waning, we sailed up the estuary of the Slaney. Cormac stood at the wheel beside Finbar, telling him the vagaries of the river, and soon we arrived at the harbor of Innis. There was no one around as we anchored, lowered the dinghy, and rowed across to shore. "I'll go on ahead," said Cormac after we had landed, and talked to my aunt and uncle. I thought he seemed suddenly nervous, and it occurred to me that the sight of him might be a shock to his relatives. Cormac had become a leper only after leaving Ireland, and rather than return home, had made his way to Furlong, hoping for help and sanctuary. But Furlong had turned Cormac away, believing his illness to be the result of his sins. Now Cormac's sores were healed, but it was still a shock for anyone to see him for the first time. I wondered how his aunt would bear it. As we waited by the harbor, a wave of gloom spread across us. Somehow, since Cormac had suggested the idea, we had seized upon Innis as a haven in our trouble, and now the fear crept in that we might not be wanted. It was cold, and Juniper and Wise Child were shivering, huddled together for warmth. I had an impression that Juniper had a touch of fever. Her cheeks looked hot, and her eyes were too big. "It can't be an easy story to tell," Finbar murmured at one point, looking in the direction where Cormac had disappeared. Eventually, after it had grown quite dark, we saw the light of torches in the distance, and heard the sound of cheerful voices. Cormac called out to us, and Finbar went forward. We heard him talking to Cormac's companions. Then the group approached, and we could see them clearly in the torchlight. An elderly man and woman with kindly expressions, and a younger couple. Several servants held the torches. "This is my Aunt Bridget," said Cormac, introducing the older woman, "and this is my Uncle Brendan." I noticed tears in the eyes of Cormac's aunt. "Imagine my joy," she said, with Cormac translating for us, "at seeing this one again. I thought I had lost him for good. It is a glorious day for us to have him back." I noticed the younger couple exchanging glances, and I doubted they were as pleased as their parents to see their cousin again. Cormac's aunt turned to Juniper. "But it's sorry I am to hear you are not well," she said, "you and the little girl. I have told the servants to make up beds for you in the house. If the men don't mind the barn, there is plenty of hay there, and we will give you some blankets." She held out her arms to Juniper, embraced her for a moment, and then started walking back with her in the direction of the house with an arm around her. It seemed to me that Juniper needed her support, and I wondered how Cormac had explained what ailed her. That first night, the hospitality was all that we could have asked for. The servants were busy making a meal when we arrived at the house. Juniper and Wise Child were carried off and put to bed. The rest of us were shown the barn, where there was plenty of room for us to sleep among the piles of soft hay. Then we went back to the house for a huge meal. Soon after it was over, I felt overcome by sleep and crept away to the barn. My dreams were broken by the men laughing and telling stories, and once I heard Finbar's voice raised in song. Wise Child recovered more quickly than Juniper, at least as far as physical well-being was concerned. She was soon out of bed, as if her suffering had changed her, or perhaps it was only that my perception had changed. She suddenly seemed taller, more grown up, not a little girl anymore. I also noticed that she seemed unusually bad-tempered. I suppose I supposed she missed the security and comfort of the White House, and perhaps of having Juniper all to herself. Once I overheard a conversation between her and Juniper. I was sitting on the doorstep of the farm whittling a boat with a knife Cormac's uncle had given me, and did not at first pay any attention. "Do you think you are cross with Finbar for having stayed away so long?" I suddenly heard Juniper say quite clearly. "Why should I be?" said Wise Child, sounding very cross indeed. "Because he left you all alone with no one to look after you, and did not come back for several years." "I did have someone to look after me, my granny, and then I had you." "Yes, but he knew that your granny was very old, and he was not to know that I would take you in." Wise Child said nothing, and I could imagine the obstinate expression on her face. Juniper went on just as if she had spoken. "You know, it might be easier for you both if you said that to him, that you felt he abandoned you. Then you could be close again like you used to be." Wise Child must have felt very upset because she suddenly shouted, "It's not your business," and stormed out. It seemed too late then to announce my presence. After about a week of struggling with fever, during which Cormac's aunt nursed her, Juniper spent less time in bed. She still looked very thin and tired, but she had begun to eat again and to take short walks around the farm. One day, when we had been at the farm for about 3 weeks, she said she thought Wise Child and I should do some lessons. She set up a table and chairs in the barn, managed to borrow some wax tablets and styluses from the village, and we spent the morning working. This was difficult for me because Wise Child was so much cleverer than me. It made me feel miserable. Juniper came and sat on the well one afternoon when I was drawing water, and said she wanted to talk to me about lessons. I thought she was going to tell me that it was hopeless trying to teach me, and I went red and kicked the bricks at the base of the well. It is awful to feel more stupid than other people. "I can't help it," I mumbled before she could say anything. "I'm just no good at it. I feel a real fool." "I have never heard such nonsense," Juniper amazed me by saying. "Of course you have not had the teaching Wise Child has had, and nobody knows what they have not been taught. But what I wanted to tell you is that I have never seen anybody learn more quickly than you do. You really work at it, whether you can do it or not, and that is the real secret. So for heaven's sake, don't start getting discouraged." "I want to make some suggestions, though," she continued. "I know you are very interested in sailing. I am going to ask Finbar to teach you sailor's lore in the mornings, when Wise Child and I are busy with lessons. Then you can share lessons with Wise Child, history and geography and stories. You and I will work by ourselves at writing and reading and languages, so that you won't feel a fool. I promise that you will do just as well as Wise Child with a bit more help." I soon realized, however, that Wise Child did not like it much when Juniper gave me lessons by myself. She would think of reasons to interrupt, and become defiant with Juniper in a way I had never noticed before. I also began to realize that since we had left the island, there had been no talk of magic. Sometimes I wondered if I had made up the whole idea of Juniper training Wise Child to be a Doran, a wise person like herself who used magic to heal the world. One afternoon I entered the barn, and it was so still and silent that I thought it was empty. Then I noticed Juniper sitting at the table with a large bowl of water in front of her. "What are you—" I began, but Juniper said, "Shh." I sat down as quietly as I could. Juniper sat in total concentration for a while, staring into the water. And then, as if that had finished, shook herself and turned to me. "Colman, do you think you could find Wise Child?" she asked. Grumbling as she did when asked to do almost anything now, Wise Child came to the barn. "I want you to use the water," Juniper said. "You know how." A look of fury crossed Wise Child's face. She moved slowly and unwillingly to the table and sat down. I know I should have gone away, but I was fascinated to see what would happen. For the next few minutes, Wise Child sat there, sighing at intervals. Finally, Juniper said quite sharply, "It's no good sighing and wanting to be somewhere else, as you know very well. You need to give yourself up to it." Wise Child continued to fidget until Juniper said, "Well, I'll leave you to it for a bit. Come, Colman, we'll go for a little walk." When we came back, Wise Child was sitting outside by the well, swinging a foot in